Okay, the colonial period in the Pacific in Oceania is really critical for understanding what is going on today, because it sort of takes three forms. In some sections, most specifically in the southern ones here, Australia, New Zealand, New Caledonia, what you get is basically European colonial powers, the British and the French, decide that they're going to basically move people to these areas. And so most famously, what you get in Australia and New Caledonia both is these become what we call convict settlements. So what you have is just like today, the whole discussion of there's too many people in prisons and it's very expensive and how do you reduce that? Well, in the 19th century, it dawned on folks, specifically first the British, that an easy way to deal with this would just basically, if you have some piece of property, and since the British did, it's literally halfway around the planet, and if you just send all the people that are in the prisons to that other place and tell them if you try to come back to England, basically we'll hang you. You pretty much then have got rid of the problem, and of course, then you've reduced your cost. It's a hell of a lot cheaper to ship someone somewhere, especially if you're not worried about the quality of it, than it is to basically house them in a prison. And so what happens is the British very early on set up Australia, specifically in the southeast area, that they're interested in. It's basically a prison colony with the idea that you're going to put all the folks who are in prisons. You have to remember, you could be put in prisons for everything from stealing a loaf of bread to whatever. And so you just basically dump the whole crew of them off here. And because it's in the middle of nowhere, because again, remember this idea of the Pacific, it's huge amounts of ocean, there's not a lot there. So the European stereotype is basically that, well, if you put them there, then they can't get out. So basically what you've done is you made Australia the prison. In the 1850s, 1860s, the French do the same thing with New Caledonia. This becomes very famous in the 1870s after the Paris Revolt, where a lot of the intellectuals in France that are, anti-government get their butts, sent off to New Caledonia for a while. But the thing is, the same thing had been going on in Australia. Now, it says something interesting that the British, at the same time, they see absolutely no problem making Australia into a convict settlement. Because of the weird relationship, and this gets to our second form of colonization, because of the weird relationship that the Europeans had, or perception the Europeans had of Polynesians, then you don't find the same thing happening. Because you have to remember, to the British perception or the European perception of the world, all Australia had were Aborigines, and those were, black fellas, as they used to call them. So there was, they weren't really considered even, they were just barely human. So, throwing a bunch of configs with them was not seen as like a big deal. I mean, who cares, right? By contrast, of course, you have the Maori, your Polynesian population in New Zealand. And so when the British decide what they're going to do with that place, there's this idea that we already have a population of people in the sense of folks that you accept as being people. So therefore you have to treat it differently. And also the climate such in New Zealand was, pretty radically different than Australia. And so what the British do in New Zealand is they actually open that up to settlement in the same way they did Canada and other places. So you encourage folks in the UK basically to move to New Zealand. Given the famines and stuff that were going on in the 19th century, the same Irish potato famine, for example, led people to North America, but also in Scotland and stuff like that, what you find is large populations of Welsh and Scottish moved to New Zealand. In fact, there's whole communities in New Zealand that speak Gaelic. There's parts you could argue that some towns in New Zealand are probably more Scottish than 90% of Scotland. So what you get is this odd sort of almost like layer of British farmer settlers, moving from rural UK, rural England, Scotland, etc., to New Zealand. Of course, with this idea of free land, pushing the Maori off. But at the same time, you really can't get rid of the Maori because the Maori are considered people also. And this weird juxtaposition, we'll see this, at the end of this set of presentations with New Zealand today, makes for a very paradoxical situation. One of the surreal aspects of this is that you have New Zealand being settled at the same time that you have Australia being settled by the British colonial administrations. In New Zealand, the relationship between the Brits and the Maori is always one that's dealt with politics and legal and, sort of two competing political entities. By contrast, in Australia, the Australians, the British that moved from Australia, basically see themselves as their only population, and the Aborigines are considered to be, essentially no better than animals. As I mentioned last time, even shooting one right into the 1870s, 1880s, in New South Wales, for example, was not really considered a major offense. So what you have is the same Brits. In other words, people coming from the same place. They're different social, aspects in the sense you have, convicts in Australia, etc. But they're still all British, members of the British, sort of ethnic cultural system, have an entirely different view of their place in the world and their place in Australia than they do in New Zealand. In New Zealand is a concept you share with a Māori. In Australia, there's no concept of sharing. That's just as true in 2022 as it was, 100 years ago, or actually 200 years ago. So what you find, and this is one reason why if you look at the two places, you find their politics, their view of who they are, their view of the place in the world, and everything is radically different. And even COVID's a good example of this in terms of the way they deal with it. New Zealand has a very different view of its place in the world vis-a-vis Australia. Now, it gets equally complicated because, of course, the third player in this sort of colonial takeover, the idea of large numbers of settlers, is New Caledonia. And in the case of New Caledonia, the French need the mineral reserves. New Caledonia is almost obscenely wealthy in terms of mineral reserves. And so there's no way that the French are going to give it up. So the French still have New Caledonia as a colony. They have never made it into an independent state or anything like that. Though there's been movements, especially from the indigenous, the Kanaka population in New Caledonia, to want independence. And so the northern part sort of, sort of a semi-independent republic under France. But there's no way that the French are going to give that up because strategically it's too central to their, their position in the world and everything else. So what you find is New Caledonia never gets that path to, colony and then independence that you see with the British regions. Now, segueing off of the New Zealand part, what you find is the European powers involved in Polynesia, which is almost entirely just the British and the Americans and the French, all basically look upon Polynesians, again, as they do with the Māori in New Zealand, as people who are actually not only legitimately people, but people who have to be sort of, managed, watched over, and protected, because again, remember, they're seen as the children of God, but they're also seen as very innocent children. And the term usually legally is they become wards, which we think that the whole Britney Spears thing recently. And that's actually also true in the mainland United States. If you live on a reservation, you're actually considered in Native American reservation in the mainland. You're actually considered a ward of the government. My family members that we had on the reservation weren't actually American citizens till the 1960s. They were actually considered wards, which means basically your child. So the federal government was your father. That's actually what they would tell you. The great white father. That's where that term comes from. And so the same attitude was sort of played off on Polynesians. That Polynesians were people, but they were so innocent and so naive that they would not survive in the nasty, cutthroat world of the 19th, 20th, 21st century. And so what you do is you basically protect them from the world outside. And you do this by setting up a system of sort of barriers and controls. And you also limit what they have access to or what they can do, because you can't trust them to make adult decisions because they're, again, quote, children, quote. And that's the way that the French treat the folks in French Polynesia. Till recently, that was the way that the British handled Polynesians and the Cooks, Tonga, Samoa, places like that. All of these were basically seen in that way. Fiji is another case in point. So in that context, you have this sort of weird, I don't know of any place else in the world that had this, this real sort of very, very paternalistic, very patronizing sense of control. And you certainly see that with, for example, the American relationship with Hawaii, specifically with Hawaiians, or this idea of sort of very paternalistic, very patronizing. Well, Hawaiians are really sweet and they're very nice and they're very good people, but you really can't put them in authority because they really don't know what they're doing. So therefore, in 1893, you basically take the authority away from them, and a few years later, you turn them into a colony so that you can protect them from the outside world. And this is still, there's still, I hate to say it, but there's still bits and pieces of this in the federal attitude towards Hawaiians, as there is with Native Americans on the U.S. mainland too. Now, the third version is just outright blatant colonialism. And this is very much closer to what we'll see when we get to Africa. So I'm also going over a little bit of detail here. And that's simply the fact that in this situation, the area is not really of importance and the people there aren't of importance. So it's not like Asia where there's a lot of resources and a lot of stuff. So there's people squabbling because there's stuff they want there. In the rest of the Pacific, people didn't really, the Europeans that wanted it, really didn't see anything of value in the Pacific. They just wanted to have it because then that made a colony. And one of the weird things to understand about European logic in the 17, 18, 1900s was that if you were a real European country, one of the ways you proved that was by having colonial possessions. So, if you didn't have colonial possessions, you were very much sort of like a second player. You're the second string. If you had colonial possessions, no matter how goofy they were, no matter how small you were as a country, then all of a sudden you were a player. So, for example, Belgium, which isn't a player at all in European politics, had huge colonial possessions in the Central African region, what's called the Belgian Congo. The Dutch, of course, had in the whole Indonesia region, other spots like that. The Portuguese had Portuguese colonies throughout, South Asia and such. And also in Africa. So what that meant is, even though they were very small countries in Europe and they weren't players in Europe politically, they were, quote, real countries, unquote, because they had colonial possessions. So colonial possessions were the equivalent of a high school kid who gets a driver's license. It meant that you weren't a child anymore, now you were an adult. And so having colonial possessions, no one was going to ask any embarrassing questions about what the colonial possessions were. You didn't even have to make any money from them, you just had to have them. So, for example, Germany becomes a unified country in 1871. Prior to that, was a bunch of independent countries. In 1871, they become a country. Well, one of the first things they have to do, if they're going to be a legit country in Europe in the late 19th century, is have colonies. So they immediately get involved in taking spots in China. And then what they do is they basically go and they colonize, or I should say, they take over all of Micronesia. So all of a sudden, all of Micronesia and parts of New Guinea become German colonies, and the Germans get heavily involved in Fiji, trying to take over all of Fiji, which doesn't work out very, or I should say Samoa, which doesn't work very well. But they do take over all of Micronesia. Now, they didn't do much there. They didn't even map most of it. They had it, but they just want to be able to say it's ours. Here's a part of the world that flies the German flag, and that legitimized them. But they were totally disinterested in the folks in Micronesia. And to a certain extent, one reason they were able to get Micronesia is because the only other colonial powers, the British, the French, even the Americans, the other players in the Pacific, didn't see Micronesia as being worth the trouble to actually, take over politically. So it was, sort of free space for the Germans to move in. And they also did the same thing in parts of Africa, as we'll see. So what you get is the Pacific then becomes a spot where you brag about controlling it, not a spot where you actually spend any resources or time or effort to do anything about it. So the British, for example, take over large parts of Melanesia, the Solomons. They end in this weird situation where they and the French both conjointly take over Vanuatu, what's now Vanuatu. It used to be called the New Hebrides. And the British end up in control of what's Papua New Guinea now. And so in that situation, unlike the way the British were treating the folks in their British colonies and Polynesia, where there was this real sort of patronizing, spend time and effort, and set the places up and make it look good because you want to take care of these children. When it gets to Melanesia, there was none of that. In Melanesia, the main reason for taking over Melanesia was so the British, or I should say the French or the Germans or someone couldn't get it. So once you had it, you just sort of sat on it like a lump. And of course, when you think about it, this is very, very different than the way they're treating Australia and New Zealand at exactly the same point in time. There's no time gap here. It's the same time. And so one of the side effects of this is that the Europeans, the British, and to a lesser extent the French, in their control of the western part, i.e. the Melanesian part of the Pacific, again, spend very little in the way of effort, time, money in that. This again is what they do very much in Africa also, because Africa ends up being the other place where because it's very late to be colonized and there's not a lot of resources to be seen there, as no one really makes any effort till colonies become part of this whole ego thing of European legitimacy, which, in 2022 hindsight is like scratching your head trying to figure out why would people see that as a logic, but it was hugely powerful at the time. And so what you get are these world systems basically coming in and taking over these areas. Now, having said that, since the British weren't going to spend a lot of time and effort in the Solomons or New Guinea or something like that, is they don't. In fact, very quickly what they do is they pawn off the management of this part of the Pacific, Melanesia, to their Australian colonial possessions. So for the latter part of the 19th century, et cetera, the British colonies in Melanesia are actually managed by Australia for England. So you get this sort of really weird situation because the British don't want to spend the time and effort. So they tell the Australians, okay, you're still a colony, but here you manage these other sub-colonies, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so this becomes really key because we move into the 20th century. And so you get a very, very different sets of sort of, assimilation of cultural, even exposure to the global world, the European, Eurocentric colonial world. In Micronesia, it doesn't happen. There is no exposure. And in Polynesia, there's this very protected sort of bubble wrap exposure. In Melanesia, again, there's almost no exposure. In your colonial possessions to the south, they become, colonial players, just like Australia, or just like India and places like that. You spend the time and effort. You've got large populations. There's large numbers of French that moved to New Caledonia. There's large numbers of Brits that moved to New Zealand, and of course the British and et cetera move and basically populate Australia. And so in that situation, what happens is you end up with very different types of areas, even though they're contiguous to each other in the Pacific. They have very, very different experiences. And probably the most dramatic probably would be the Micronesian region, because it's under German control, very light control. We don't even have good ethnographic accounts. The Germans didn't even send folks to study the folks in Micronesia to let us know what their languages were, particularly, how they did stuff. There's very little known about Micronesian societies on places like Palau, for example, at the time of European contact, and almost none, even in the period of German control, which goes on until 1914. 1914, World War I starts up. The Japanese, who, if you remember, were interested in growing, basically take a look at this and immediately invade and take over the German colonies in Micronesia. So Micronesia moves from German control from about 1880 to 1914, so 30 years. Then moves to Japanese control for another, actually just about 30 years. But again, the Japanese aren't interested in the Micronesian region in terms of what's on the islands, and they're certainly totally disinterested in the people on the islands, and they're totally disinterested in the cultures in the islands. They're interested in the islands because, again, one, they want to be a colonial power, which means you have to have colonial possessions. So the same logic that everyone else was using. And secondly, they want these islands because they want strategic control in the Northern Pacific. And so having these islands mean that you can basically turn them into forts and all sorts of other stuff like that to basically then try to control this part of the world. The very same strategy the Chinese are using right now in the Sprat and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea in 2022. So these become part of the Japanese Empire, which persists right into the latter part of World War II, where most of the really large number end up invaded and taken over by the Americans. After World War II, ironically, the United States takes over the region and does exactly the same thing. The United States takes over Micronesia and treats it pretty much the same way the Japanese and the Germans have. Just, oh, that's right, yeah, we have islands in that part of the world, which is not what they were supposed to do. We'll get to that next time. So this is the colonial world. And sort of the paradox that occurs out of all this then is you end up with sort of three types of colonial worlds. You end up with the Polynesian colonial world, where the Europeans are very visible, but they're not a huge part of the population. Unless you're like Hawaii, New Caledonia, Australia, New Zealand, where you have large migrant populations. But even then, until recently, the migrant population in Hawaii was not wholly from the US mainland. It was largely Asian who were basically brought in as workers, the same way that the Philippines and Indonesia do that now. So that's the major part of the population. The number of percentage of folks in the US mainland is actually quite small. They had huge amounts of power. They owned a lot of real estate, but they were not large on the ground in numbers until basically late mid 20th century. In that regard, we're actually sort of like a lot of the rest of Polynesia. But in this other area, then what you get what you might call the Melanesian and Micronesian scenario, which is sort of almost entirely neglected colonial settlements. And this has huge implications, as we'll see when World War II suddenly comes to show in this place.